Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the latest installment of the Authors at Google series. It is my pleasure to introduce David Rothkopf, author of the book Superclass, The Global Power Elite and the World They Are Making. Professor Rothkopf has taught at Columbia University's Graduate School of International and Public Affairs and is a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, specializing in U.S. foreign policy and economic strategy. As a Carnegie Fellow, he wrote Running the World, the inside story of the National Security Council and the Architects of American Power, the leading volume on the National Security Council. Mr. Rothkopf has served as the Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade during the administration of Bill Clinton. He is also an international business consultant, serving as chairman and CEO of the Rothkopf Group and president and CEO of Garten Rothkopf. He has written articles for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and has been featured on NPR. We are pleased to have Mr. Rothkopf here today to discuss his new book and his views on the issues at hand. As usual, we will have time for questions after the talk. Thank you.
Well, hi, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a lovely day to be here, and it's a lovely day to have an opportunity to meet with a different group of people. What I'd like to do is get as quickly as possible into questions and answers. So I'll talk for 15 or 20 minutes, but while I'm doing it, if you've got thoughts or questions, I'm happy to take them and to go into any direction. You know, the topic of this book seems particularly fresh in a week where we in the United States seem to be engrossed in the debate about elitism. And, you know, if you turn on CNN, you get pundit after pundit offering different views on elitism. You know, I think it's kind of an interesting commentary that we have, you know, one candidate who is the multimillionaire heir to a political dynasty, criticizing another candidate who was giving a speech at the home of a billionaire who was raising money for their campaign, also being criticized by another candidate who's a multimillionaire son of a Navy four-star admiral who was the son of a Navy four-star admiral, all of whom are, you know, in the race to compete for the job of the multimillionaire president who is the son of a president who himself was the son of a senator. You know, this is sort of how the U.S. political system is working. And I think when you sort of see that, you've got to ask yourself, is elitism the issue or are elites the issue? And, you know, my sense is that it's worth studying elites. And fortunately, I had this opportunity as a consequence of being asked to write this book. What happened was I had written this book called Running the World, and it was a history of the National Security Council and how foreign policy was made in the White House. And apparently it did well enough that a publisher in New York called me up, and they said, would you like to do another book? And, you know, I am sufficiently neurotic to think that, you know, I better act quickly because this phone call's not going to be another call like this. And so I said, oh, okay, you know, and they were like, well, what would you like to do it on? And as I was going around doing the book, Running the World, what I found was that in every city I went to, there was always somebody who would raise their hand and say, that's the trouble with you Americans. You all think you are running the world. Or do you really think that that Dick Cheney is running the world? And this, you know, taught me a couple of things, one of which was, you know, irony in titles is probably not a great idea because it's often not interpreted properly in the audience. But the other is that there's a real appetite for knowing who may, in fact, have more influence than others in the world. And so I thought, let's undertake a kind of a systematic look at this. Now, I think on some level, the publisher was hoping that I would appeal to an audience, you know, like yourselves, of rabid conspiracy theorists, people who thought that, you know, these plots were being made in back rooms someplace. And of course, everybody's interested in conspiracy theories. I, you know, growing up as a Jewish boy in New Jersey, heard a lot about the world Jewish conspiracy. And I thought to myself, you know, that sounds good. That sounds like a great opportunity. There are not a heck of a lot of Jews, and perhaps I could get myself a good posting, nothing flashy, but perhaps, Canada, maybe I could be in charge of Canada, or conceivably world sorghum prices, or, something that would be rewarding if, problem was, of course, there is no world Jewish conspiracy, and, more is the pity, because I think, frankly, if there was, we'd probably be, would have done a better job running the world than has been done to date, say. Now, having said that, most of these conspiracy theories don't bear up under scrutiny, whether it's the Illuminati or the Freemasons or the notion that people somehow go off to Davos and sit in a room and plan how GDP is going to be in France next year or what's going to happen to hemlines. Because the people who are the most powerful are disparate and self-interested and have gotten to where they are by virtue of the fact that they're self-interested. And yet, nonetheless, the people who are the most powerful are changing in very profound ways in our time. And this was of special interest to me. When I was a student at Columbia, there was a book written by a guy named C. Wright Mills, which was called The Power Elite. And in this book, what C. Wright Mills looked at was, in the 50s, how the people who ran American politics and American business and American finance and the U.S. military were a very small community, and that there were sort of revolving doors between these communities, interlocking directorates, if you will, and that this was a defining characteristic of the way the United States worked. And what I had seen in the course of my career was that there was something similar happening on a global scale, and that this was entirely new. And in fact, there have always been elites. And the story of every era is really the story of elites rising up, overreaching, people reacting to those elites, and there being an adjustment. Now, typically the people who react to those elites, by the way, say they're doing so in the name of the people, but they end up doing it in the name of the people and then assuming the authority themselves. And so you go from one type of elite to another type of elite. But if you look at today's elites, they're different in a number of key respects. And that's really what I wanted to get at. So this book is not one of these kind of books of sort of the pornography of the rich, where it talks about how big their planes are, although I talk about that a little bit, or how, the length of their boats and that kind of thing, although I do talk about it a little bit. It's really about the changing nature of power in the global era. Because the group that I define as the superclass, and I'll talk about them in a second, are really the most globalized group on the planet, and they are the group that's driving globalization more than any other group on the planet. So to understand them is to understand the forces shaping our time in an important way. So what we tried to do was we tried to find a definition that would be simple enough to work, that would allow us to get a group that was small enough to take a look at. And so the definition that we came up with was people who are influencing the lives of millions of people across borders on a regular basis. In other words, people with global influence, people who use that influence. So it's not just rich people. It can be people who run big organizations. It can be, grassroots organizer, the woman in Vermont who decided to take on global landmines and put together a grassroots coalition that changed the way governments worked and changed legislation in countries and actually changed the way the world viewed landmines. She would meet this criteria if she kept that kind of power on an ongoing basis. Sometimes, performers might have it. Bono is certainly a member of this group because he's using that power in a certain kind of a way. Angelina Jolie, possibly Brad Pitt, certainly the two of them together, they probably make it into the group. Britney Spears doesn't make it into the group. I'm sorry to disappoint you. But, there are some people who've got a lot of power and influence, and they don't cross that line. The Pope, he makes it into the group. Religious leaders make it into the group. And when you use that definition, and you go through big businesses and big finance and governments and the military, cultural groups, religious groups, you actually come up with about 6,000. We came up with 6,600 names. Now, that's significant in that each one of those people represents 1 in a million on the planet. Each one has that kind of concentration of power. And in fact, one of the things that distinguishes this group from past elites is that the concentration of power, particularly financial resources and economic resources, in the hands of fewer and fewer people, is one of the great trends of our time, and it's kind of underreported. It's underexplored as a trend. So, for example, when C. Wright Mills wrote The Power Elite in 1956, the defense budget of the United States, which was in real dollar terms smaller than the defense budget is now, was more than the total annual sales of every major corporation in the United States. Now today, when we have a defense budget that in real dollar terms is larger than any defense budget that we've had since 1944, the sales of the two biggest companies, Exxon and Walmart, is 50% higher than the defense budget. And so in area after area after area, you see this enormous concentration. The 250 biggest corporations in the world have sales equivalent to 1/3 of global GDP. The 50 largest financial institutions in the world have assets of $48.5 trillion, which is 1/3 of the assets that are in global financial markets today. And that kind of concentration occurs everywhere. It occurs in field after field after field, even in military power. There are 180, 200 countries in the world. Of those countries, only 30 or 40 have weapons of mass destruction. Only 20 have the ability to launch a missile. Only 8 or 9 have nuclear weapons capability. Only 3 have air forces with over 1,000 airplanes in them. Only 1 has the ability to truly fight a global war or a war in space. That one country spends more money on defense than every other country in the world added up together. The principal alliance of that one country, the NATO alliance, spends 85% of what is spent on the world on defense. The top 10 defense contractors in the world are all located within NATO. So again, concentration in the hands of a few. And some of you may have read in other kinds of books this notion that was come up with by an Italian economist at the turn of the century, Vilfredo Pareto, which is the 80-20 rule. And you know that the 80-20 rule is reductive. And so within each 80-20 rule, there's another 80-20 rule. And you see that in global society, where the top 85% of assets on the planet are owned by the top 10% of the people. The majority of those are owned by the top 2%. 40% of all assets are owned by the top 1%. The 1,100 richest people on Earth have assets that are equivalent to that, actually almost double that, of the 2.5 billion poorest people on Earth. And so you find this concentration over and over. In religious groups, you find the concentration. There are 4,300 religious groups on the planet Earth. Of the 4,300, there are only 20 that have more than 1 million adherents. Of the 20, there are only 2 that have more than 1 billion adherents. So the people at the top of those 2 have hugely disproportionate power in the same way that the people on top of those financial institutions have hugely disproportionate power. And we've seen a perfect example of this in the not too distant past in terms of the financial crisis. Because what happened during the financial crisis was an illustration of how this power works. Because the government, the Fed, and the Treasury Department couldn't solve the crisis alone, because the power of national governments in a global era is limited. It's kind of like the invisible fence around your yard stops your dog from getting out of the yard. Well, borders stop sovereignty, and countries can't influence global markets and other kinds of transnational issues as they once did. And it is in these cracks that informal clusters of the superclass end up having their greatest influence. And so the leaders in the financial community lobbied for years to keep regulation off of them in global markets. I always found this a little bit suspect, because the same people who would say, look, we'll self-regulate, despite the history of our industry for overreaching and the booms and busts that ensued, they would never get in a self-regulating taxi cab. They would never brush their teeth with self-regulated toothpaste. And yet, they managed to persuade the authorities to leave them clear out in these markets because the authorities couldn't extend their sovereignty anyway over them. And you had these buildup of these enormous markets that have huge, huge components of risk in them. Risk that was opaque to the world, even though the one legal criteria for managing a fund in the United States that's absolutely clear is that the managers, the board managing a fund, need to know the risk inherent in what they're managing. And we're talking about all sorts of new regulations, but if we enforced that one, we wouldn't have had this problem. The problem is you can't enforce it. But anyway, so these huge businesses grew up in these advanced securities with counterparties that nobody knew about. They weren't regulated. And when the time came and a crisis emerged, two things happened. One, the Fed, because the Fed only has a limited amount of cash to put into markets to deal with this stuff, and the Treasury, because the Treasury only has limited influence over these things, working with foreign governments said, what do we do? And they do what they do in other crises. They convened the heads of the biggest financial institutions. And I went and I talked to Tim Geithner about a year ago. Tim Geithner is the president of the New York Fed. And he said, one of my principal powers right now is convening power. What I do is when there's a crisis, I get the heads of these big financial institutions down in a conference room or on a conference call, and I say, guys, you've got to work together with us. You've got to help solve this problem. And they end up being the source of the solution. If the financial institutions are willing to go along, then you can stop the bleeding. You can stop the selling. You can give a company a chance in these things. Or in this case, you could get J.P. Morgan to buy out Bear Stearns. Geithner said that this has happened sufficiently frequently that Lloyd Blankfein, who's the CEO of Goldman Sachs, would refer to this group as the 14 families, which is kind of a Godfather kind of reference. The interesting thing about this 14 families, this group that is required to collaborate with national governments to solve a problem like this, is that they're from the US, they're from the UK, they're from Germany, and they're from Switzerland. There are none from Japan, none from anywhere else in Asia. In fact, none from most of the countries of the world. Furthermore, even though many of the guys who run these organizations are perfectly good guys, working hard, trying to do the best that they can, the reality is that they are legally obligated to do everything they can in the interest of their shareholders and not in the interest of the public at large. So leaving it to the market is not the same thing as having governance that, as governance is supposed to, derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. And that's the problem. In the global era, most of the super empowered people are operating on a global stage where governments can't operate, where they're filling in the void, where they're influencing a whole host of transnational issues in extremely important ways. And even when they are doing it with the best of intentions, they are not doing it with the consent of the governed. They're not doing it representing people at large. Now, one of the reasons that they can't do it representing people at large, by the way, is that they don't represent people at large. If you look at this 6,600 people, they don't look like the world. 2/3 of them live on one side of the Atlantic or the other. Although, and I'll come back to this, the fastest growing component is on the far side of the Pacific. But what is the most underrepresented group, do you think, in this superclass? Anybody, any ideas? Well, you might think that, but no, they're better represented than the group that I'm talking proportionally. What's the most underrepresented group? I'll give you a hint. It's the majority of people on Earth. The most underrepresented group is women. 94% of the superclass is male. 6% are women. You can't possibly think that the power structure of the planet Earth is functioning properly if the majority population is so grotesquely underrepresented in a group like this. And even in countries where you do have women participating in the political process, the average participation in legislatures is 17%. So something is, extremely wrong in this respect. Another thing that I see all these banners around the room of colleges and universities. Of the superclass, we looked at a subset of the superclass. About 1/3 went to one of 20 schools. Now, this is kind of mind-blowing too, right? Because this is people from 180 countries. 6,600 people. And about a third went to one of 20 schools. And, that school, Yale is one of them, and Harvard and a couple of others. Now, if you go and you want to be the CEO of a U.S. company, it's a slightly different path. Most CEOs of U.S. company come out of state schools, actually. But that's an aberration. And most of the other people in this group, certainly financial elites, political elites, and others, are coming out of a very, very small number of colleges and universities. And there are all sorts of connections. In fact, you guys here would appreciate this probably better than most, but one of the great things that makes modern elites different from past elites is that one of their force multipliers is their ability to plug into networks and their ability to, use the close connections that they forged through modern telecommunications, through modern transportation, to get to anybody anywhere in the world in one or two moves. I walked through here and I saw a sign, 6 degrees of Google, downstairs. But the reality is that most of these people are 1 or 2 degrees away. I talked to Steve Schwartzman, the head of Blackstone, and he said, if I want to talk to anybody in any country, it's 1 or 2 phone calls. And he gave an example, and I talk about it in the book, where they wanted to do a deal, and there was a problem in Germany, and he got on the phone, and he called up Angela Merkel, the chancellor, and he got to see her, and 2 weeks later, the deal got done. And that is another way that power works in this. This is a group that uses the power of networks. Now, some of this is perfectly benign. In fact, some of it is beyond benign. If Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are the exception to the rule, and they take very substantial portions of their wealth and they devote it to philanthropic ends, and the average, by the way, in this group is 1% of the wealth. So when people take all of their wealth or close to all of their wealth, as Andrew Carnegie did 100 years ago, and devote it to that, that's a wonderful thing. You can't complain. In fact, as a sign of how one of the big distinctions between past and present is that private power is much more significant than public power. Public power was in the past. You can look at the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation puts more money in the field to cure disease in the world than the World Health Organization. About $1.5 billion a year. Well, that's fantastic. And again, you can't fault them for it. But $1.5 billion a year from them and all the best of intentions does not make that group accountable to anybody. And so you don't want them to stop. You want them to be engaged, right? But it doesn't take the responsibility away from governments or from us to have government mechanisms that'll allow us to take care of issues in a way that's more responsive to public needs. And when you look at the way the world has developed over the course of the past 30 years, the period of which, one guy I was talking to the other day about this referred to as market fundamentalism. You could call it Reagan-Thatcherism, or you could call it Volcker-Greenspanism, or as somebody I talked to once they've referred to it as Friedmanism, from Milton Friedman and Tom Friedman. But I call it marketism. It's like, leave it to the markets. Markets will take care of everything. Governments don't work, markets do work. The rising tide lifts all boats. Let's let things go. That's what's really unleashed the power. That's what's really made a lot of this concentration of power take place. And it's fueled a lot of growth. And the adherents of this philosophy have said, well, look, the bottom has gone up. The absolute number of poor people in the world has contracted. But in country after country and between countries and on a global basis, the one distinguishing characteristic of the past 30 years of leaving it to the markets and the impulse within the markets to seek efficiency, which means to seek scale, which means to seek concentration of power in the hands of fewer and fewer organizations, the consequence of this is almost certainly inequality. And one of the questions that we've got to grapple with is whether efficiently operating global markets actually exacerbate the problem of inequality in the world. And you can look at it by any measure. 100 years ago, at the height of the robber baron era, the richest countries in the world were 9 times wealthier than the poorest countries in the world. Today, they're over 100 times wealthier than the poorest countries in the world. Used to be that the richest people in Manhattan were 9 times wealthier than the poorest. Today, they're 90 times wealthier than the poorest. Used to be in the 70s that the CEO of a company made 35 times the average employee in a US company. Today, they make 370 times the average employee in a US company. You saw the alpha list, possibly, if you picked up the New York Times today, the top 25 hedge fund managers in the world. And the top hedge fund manager in the United States last year made $3 billion. There were a couple who made a couple billion. There were several who made $1 billion. Now, there are a lot of people that say, hey, this is the way it should be. Let everybody, let 1,000 flowers bloom. These guys earned it. They deserve it. It's a little unsettling that that guy who made $3 billion made it by betting against the mortgage markets, but he earned it. That's what the market system is all about. Well, we've had thousands of years of human evolution without this kind of grotesque hypercompensation going on. And so the question is, how do you deal with it? And one of the principal conclusions you can come to is in the global era, wherever you stand on these issues, we don't have the mechanisms to deal with it because national governments are ill-equipped to make transnational decisions. And if you were to run, any of you were to run for political office in the United States and say, well, we need to cede sovereignty to some multilateral organization, that would be the end of your career. It would be over. You do that in any other country, it's over because national sovereignty is considered to be something kind of sacred. And so you cannot, you can't, pursue this kind of an approach. And so, the consequence is that we have two kinds of institutions in the world, global institutions. We have weak ones and we have dysfunctional ones. And some are weak and dysfunctional. And so, in that space, you don't have a publicly elected group that counterbalances the privately elected group, and you get this kind of grotesque and growing inequality. And it's happening everywhere. In every country on earth, the exception of India and China, which are kind of sui generis because of the size of their markets, middle classes have shrunk over the past 25 years. In China, even though absolute poverty has been reduced, the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, has almost doubled over the course of the past couple of decades. So you've got growth, you've got some good things, but you've got growing inequality, and you've got to ask yourself, is this the way the world is supposed to work? What's the deal that's being offered to most people on the planet? What's the deal that's being offered? There are 3 billion people on the planet Earth who live on less than $2 a day, who've never heard a dial tone. There are 4 billion people who live lousy lives. And of the other 2 billion who make something like a living, it's worth thinking about that the top 2,000 companies have about 70 million employees. They've got about 5 dependents each, so that's about 500 million people. There's a bunch of companies that supply them and distribute their goods who depend on them, and that's maybe another 500 million people, which means that half of all the gainfully employed people on Earth report to the CEOs and boards of a couple of thousand companies. And the boards are very tightly woven. Of the 5 largest companies on Earth, the 70 people who are boards and management of those 5 largest companies are on the boards and management of another 150 of the world's largest companies and 25 of those of the world's largest universities. So this is a very, very tightly woven together world of a few giant organizations with enormous resources that are shaping this planet in disproportionate ways. Now, the question becomes, where do we go from here? What do we do about it? Is backlash inevitable? And, a lot of us think to ourselves, well, it can't happen in our time. But throughout history, it's happened. It happened in ancient Greece. It happened in Renaissance China. It happened in the 19th century when the trust busters responded to John D. Rockefeller and the other robber barons of the era. Problem is, we don't have the mechanisms to do it today. And I think that one of the great challenges for the generation that many of you are going to be is, if the global community is knit together, if we actually start viewing it as a global community, what shape is that global community going to take? And is it going to be a different shape from before? For 400 years, we've used the Treaty of Westphalia and that idea that nation states were the building blocks of society to shape the way the world is supposed to work, to shape our views of it. But we're now at a point where globalization's taking place, and it's not a reversible trend, it's a historical trend. And inequality is growing. Governance systems don't work on the global stage. National governments are falling behind. They're relatively weaker than they've ever been. That's likely to continue. And the question is, what fills the void? Is it nationalism and reaction as offered by Hugo Chavez or Mahmoud Ahmadinejad or Vladimir Putin or Lou Dobbs, God forbid? Or is it something else? And my sense is it can be something else, and it can be something that keeps what's good that we've discovered in the way that markets work and so forth. But we have to start looking in the world in a different way. And just as Google was able to go and say, look, I think we can go and see the way people gather information in a completely different way and come up with a whole new paradigm for the collection and the sharing of human knowledge. We've got to realize that we've got a kind of a blank slate in terms of the way human society is organized, that there's a kind of a systems design challenge here, and that we can't just assume that society remains organized the way it's always been in an era that is hugely different from what's come before it. And that's going to require the same kind of creativity and different mechanisms of governance, not hierarchic, networked, layered, some public-private, some in sectoral areas, some within regions, some on a truly global basis. And there will be catalysts. I think climate change is a catalyst. You can't fight climate change with a coalition of the willing. You have to fight climate change with everybody in. You need mechanisms where everybody is in, and there's real enforcement mechanisms. And some of those mechanisms, like global carbon markets, may require global regulatory markets and standards and agreements that will take us closer to the kind of balance between private power and freedom that enable people to innovate and get the rewards that they need to fuel future innovation, and effective, efficient public power that can counterbalance that and ensure that the poor and the relatively disenfranchised have a voice against those few whose voices are so much louder, whose reach is so much broader, whose influence is so much greater. Or else, somebody else is going to come up with the solution. It is going to be more reactive. It is going to be more disruptive. It is going to cost us all. It is likely to be very painful. That's the history of transitional moments throughout humankind. And we are at a transitional moment. And we will either define the moment or the moment will define us. And that's why studying this superclass is so interesting. And I have now spoken for 35 minutes, which is a lot like the 15 I said I was going to speak for. But it gives an amount of time for you to ask questions about the superclass, about this, about the power, whatever you want. I'm very happy to go and answer any question about the last book, about the next book. What would you like?
Actually, I have a twofold question. One is, I would like to question your perception of ownership. It's also different nowadays than it used to be centuries ago, because we no longer hoard the wealth the same way kings or nobility used to hoard it in material sort of quantities in the deposit boxes anymore. So is it really bad that certain minuscule fracture of people is possessing such a huge wealth, because their method of possession is very drastically different, and it's more active and it's more wealth disseminating? And the second part to that question, if it is wrong or if it is prone to some negative consequences, are there realistic checks which, for instance, could take a temporal hold of this wealth without denying this wealth to these people and using it, basically leasing wealth from Bill Gates in some way? Or
well, Okay, let's take those two questions. They're both excellent questions. I think the nature of wealth has changed a lot in the world. In fact, I think one of the great revolutions that's been a little bit overlooked because of the sweep of the IT revolution, for example, is one of the revolutions it facilitated, which is the securitization revolution, which is a revolution that allowed the private sector to start creating the vehicles in which wealth was contained and to strip them apart and to allow trading to take place in subsets of subsets of subsets of those assets. And there is something good, as you say, about the distributive quality of this, and there are probably some shock-absorbing qualities to having the wealth broadly disseminated. However, even in that case, first of all, risk is much greater than it's ever been. We don't even know what the risks are associated with many of these markets. There's $30 to $40 trillion in derivatives markets where you don't know who the counterparties are. And so that's a potential problem. And, that's a different kind of problem from the king having all of his jewels and gold in a box in the basement, but it's a problem nonetheless. And also, a huge amount of this is artificial value driven by trading systems, which are controlled by very few people. There are estimates that 30 to 50% of trading is by hedge funds. There are 10,000 hedge funds. But of the 10,000 hedge funds, the top 300 control 80% of the assets. And the top 100 control 65% of the assets. So very, very few people are driving this trading. They're, by the way, also setting the way that CEOs are compensated, and so they have a disproportionate influence in that regard. So some parts better, some parts worse. I don't think we know what the real risks are, and I don't think we're going to stop and say, well, let's regulate this until there's a calamity, and then we'll say, let's not have that calamity again. Now, the other question was, is there a way to handle this that's redistributive, or should it be redistributive? And I'm not sure that it should be. I mean, I think that taxation and similar things do play an important role in society, and I do think that people who benefit from public goods that are created by governments should pay for them. And they should pay for them in a way that benefits them ultimately by enhancing stability, by educating everybody, by creating infrastructure, by providing for the peace, security, and so forth. But I think as much of it is not just redistribution, it's just regulation. It's just creating counterbalancing forces that exist on a and there have always been some that would say, this speaks for the voices of the people. And I'm more concerned about the atrophying of democracy than I am about how much money these people have. So that to me is really the centrally important issue. Yeah.
So to what extent is the superclass self-perpetuating system where the sons of admirals and senators become part of the superclass? And to what extent is the superclass more of an open system, subject to churn, new people coming in, outsiders, replacing people in the superclass?
Well, it's much more open to change than it's ever been. It's much less result of inheritance than it's ever been. There are still plenty of people who are in it because they've inherited wealth. But power is much more associated with institutional linkages today. People hold those jobs for 3, 4, 5 years at the top of an organization, and then they may move on. And many of them move out of this group of the superclass. And some people might say, well, then it's not a class. Or it's not the same as class was. And I'm willing to stipulate that. That's not really what I'm looking at. What I'm looking at is where at any given moment is power concentrated, how many people are managing that concentrated power, and what's the consequence for the rest of us. I think, sort of an embedded question, though, and I think one that's maybe a little more troubling and unsettling for a lot of people is they equate openness and this kind of transience with a meritocracy. That, well, if you work hard and you're smart, you're going to get to the top. Well, that's just not true. Now, some of you are too young to realize it, but you'll discover that kids who you went to college with, who were less smart than you, who worked less hard than you, will become much more successful than you for reasons that have to do with the inequitable distribution of luck within society than anything else. My researcher on this book lived, down the hall at Harvard from this guy, Mark Zuckerberg, and, every day she picks up the paper and starts to weep silently to herself. I was working harder. I think I was smarter than that dude. And but several $1 billion later, it's not that I'm not disparaging what he's accomplished. It's a miracle, but that's the inequitable distribution of luck. And if people were born with exactly your DNA and all of your energy, but they were born in Papua New Guinea or they were born in Togo, they're not in the game. Just as gender is destiny in this group, sadly, tragically, and unsustainably in my mind, geography is destiny. And there are a whole bunch of other factors that keep people from getting to the top. And even in the country with the greatest income mobility in the world, which the United States has historically been, if you're born in the bottom 60%, you have a 1 in 20 chance of getting into the top echelon of US society. So there are even impediments in that regard. So power's more transient, it's more institutional, it's more private, it's less public, it's less military power than it has been in the past. But we're not quite at the point of meritocracy. We need a little bit more work. And we can only measure that by which any person with aspirations and talent has the ability, on a level playing field to achieve the same. Go here and then here.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first one is, does anyone that works for Google belong to that class? And the second one is, does anyone track this ongoing, the connections and kind of visualizing this, all the work that you've done, but every year publishes this list and these connections?
No, nobody does, but if you want to talk to me about it later, I think it's an interesting idea, and we've thought about it. I have the list, and I go to these things, and everybody's like, "Well, can I see the list?" But the problem is, in a transient group, the list changes. 4 weeks ago, the CEO of Bear Stearns was on this list. 4 weeks ago, Victor Bout, the Russian arms trader, was on this list. He's now in the slammer, so he's off the list. So there is this kind of, dynamic nature of the list, and I think it'd be interesting to look at. Certainly, the founders of Google and the people who run Google, which is kind of one of the great dynamos of modern business, are definitely on the list. And in fact, I believe in the Newsweek article that was published on this, which was the cover story in Newsweek International a week ago, your two founders were tied for 20th in a ranking of this list, even though the book doesn't go in for rankings much. So not only is Google in there, it's you've got influence right at the top. Follow-up question. If it's okay with you, I'll give him a follow-up question.
Yeah,
all right.
fine.
Do you think it would be a worthwhile exercise to track them, or is it kind of pointless?
Well, look, I mean, I think it'd be a fascinating exercise. I don't think it's absolutely the essential exercise, because I think the essential exercise is understanding the nature and the dynamics. However, you can't really understand the nature and the dynamics if you don't understand the nature of the group. So if the group evolves, I think it's important. And for example, the fastest growing segment of the group are Asians. And I believe that one of the great powers of the group is agenda setting. And so therefore, if you get people with different values and a different sort of approach, say, to world affairs, growing in this group, they're likely to have greater influence within this group as the networks grow and they become more dominant within the networks. And so tracking that change is significant. And you see, look at the Forbes list of billionaires. Last year, the 3 countries producing the most new billionaires were Russia, India, and China. Well, that has impact in the way the world is looked at, in what is acceptable in markets and who's doing the deals and who has the capital. And, asset allocation is one of the great powers that people like this have. And so knowing who they are at any given moment, I think could be a useful thing. Yes?
So I want to thank you for coming here. There's a lot of really good statistics that you gave. I just wanted to say that I think part of the problem comes from, you said that globalization is not reversible. There's always been an elite class. We don't have the tools to solve this. It'll be a challenge. I think that attitude is part of the problem. Humans live for 3 million.
Which attitude?
The attitude that...
I mean, which of those things is an attitude and which of them is a fact?
Well, I think the general attitude is that this is a problem that we need to learn how to solve, where in reality, humans live for 3 million years without these things, and we don't need to come up with maybe a new solution to the problem, but in fact just looking to 6,000 years ago when these problems didn't even exist. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, but I don't even know what that means. So I mean, I think it's fine to say it, but let's probe it a little bit more. 6,000 years ago, there were a different set of problems. There were also elites. Those elites rose up, and and new systems emerged. And in fact, it wasn't too long after that you had this crisis produce the birth of democracy in Greece. This same exact kind of conflict. And so these historical trends produce innovation. And all I'm saying is that we've had the same system of organizing the international life for 400 years, and a huge number of things have changed, and it's time for a new system. Doesn't mean it's time to throw out every value and idea that we've ever had, because a lot of those values and ideas are hard-learned and worth keeping. But the system needs to change.
I agree. I think looking to the future and new solutions may not be as valuable as looking to the past.
We always make a mistake if we choose one or the other. The past is full of lessons, but we have to recognize that where we're going has a lot of sort of new frontiers and uncharted waters and may require some innovation as well.
I agree with that.
Yes.
Thanks. So along the lines of those new frontiers, I wanted to probe a little bit more into your comment on climate change as a catalyst for revolution, it almost feels like, the way that you put it. And also tying into that, you said the leading nations of the world, it was like the UK, the United States, Switzerland, Germany, and that's where these influential people come from. And yet,
well, that was specifically in the case of global financial markets.
Oh, okay. And well, in terms of global financial, okay, well, maybe I can back off of that. But I was thinking, well, Germany's done a lot more in terms of sustainability, and how did these financial markets tie into preventing this sort of overwhelming problem of climate change?
Well, look, I think climate change is a much greater issue than most policymakers give it credit for, even today, even as there is a growing consensus. I think that, first of all, in full disclosure, I have a consulting company. What we do is green energy. So all I do all day long is deal with the intersection of energy and new energy technologies and climate change. And so, I obviously believe that that's, a transformational trend of our time. But I think that the data has come to show that not only is there a crisis, but that the urgency of solving the crisis is much greater than we thought it was, that new data suggests that it's likely even more urgent than that, and that it is not something that can be solved by a small group of nations acting alone or through the kind of ineffective global mechanisms like the United Nations, where you have sort of talking shops, but you don't have any enforcement capability. And so it seems to me where you've got, Ronald Reagan once made this kind of silly joke, which, for him, maybe, was as far as he could go, was you want to get everybody in the world together, tell them that they're going to be space aliens invading, and then if we have this common threat, that'll unify us. Well, the space aliens are landing. That's what climate change is. It is a common threat that changes everything for everybody on a national security level, on an energy security level, on an environmental security level, in terms of immigration, in terms of a whole host of things. And so it seems to me that kind of massive, urgent need that touches everybody can be the catalyst for finally coming up with some kind of transnational mechanism that works. And, maybe that's a little hopeful, but I think it may not happen until there's some crisis, and then it'll be the catalyst. But I'm not sure what the other is. You would have thought the threat of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction might be the thing that did it. It didn't. You would have thought after the history of the 20th century that perhaps stopping genocide would be the thing that did it. It didn't. So, there is past experience suggests that maybe nothing will do it, but this one seems big. It seems like it will touch everybody. I think it will redefine the way we look at international affairs, the way we look at international economics. It'll force us to invent a whole new kind of carbon economics, which I think is a good thing, and mechanisms to facilitate that and to regulate it. I think it'll change the way we look at national security. And that's why I see it as a potentially really potent catalyst for the kind of changes that, if extended more broadly, could really have benefits.
Awesome, thanks.
Yes, sir.
So you mentioned some examples of people migrating towards the elite class. You said Russian billionaires in India, and the rest of Asia. I think there's also people who are in this new environmental crisis consortium, so to speak. So there's lots of people migrating towards that elite class. And what are the indicators that these people will assimilate the way the elite class will change the way the elite class works versus the indicators that say that these people will be assimilated by the way the elite class works today?
Well, I think they're both present. I think that there is some obvious assimilation that goes on, and we can talk about the class of, IT billionaires that have come out and are doing all these wonderful philanthropic things, but if you study the way they made their money, it looks a lot like the way, robber barons made their money in the 19th century. Pretty tough practices on a competitive basis, pretty single-minded focus on their bottom line and take no prisoners. So there are strong similarities there. Again, I don't think the superclass is a monolith. I think it's a very diverse group with often opposing views. It can't be a source of conspiracies as a consequence of that. But as new groups enter it, their interests will align around different things. And as those interests align, because they're so powerful and they'll be networked together, they will have disproportionate influence over the outcomes as other people will. And that's the issue. The issue isn't that they're some perfect machine for global domination. The issue is that they will have hugely disproportionately more influence, and that'll skew the system. It'll move the needle away from what we would normally seek or expect from a successfully representative governance system.
My fear is that I believe the trend is dominated, like you said, by self-interest. And as these people become, you mentioned dictators that first represent the people and then assume the power of the people. I think there's a danger in that as well. And if you think of self-interest as the overriding influence in how these operations will align, then I fear that it's just going to be wave after wave rather than any kind of fundamental correction.
It may be so. It certainly has been so to a large extent. But maybe I can conclude on this point. I also think we live in the best time in the history of the world. People live longer. They have more food. They have more access to information. They have better education. They have better prospects for tomorrow. So I believe progress works. I believe we gain with progress. And so even though we will have even though there will be challenges, it's my sense that there will be an evolution, and net discussions like this are part of that evolution. Small parts, but these things work in millions of parts. Anyway, it's been a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much.